It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's session of the Aberdeen and Bonn Global Conversations about religious peace with Wayne Typraek. My name is Tom Weber. I'm the director of the Center for Global Security and Governance. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of both of our institutions, and I will also pass on to my co-organizer, Ulrich Schlie, who is the director of CASIS of the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn. For those of you who are new to this speaker series, this series aims to jointly between our two institutions use the virtual space to explore issues of war and peace, of security and strategy, both in the past and in the present. Maybe before I'll do the introduction, I'll pass over to Ulrich Schlie, if that's convenient for Ulrich. Does that work, Ulrich? Maybe we'll give Ulrich a bit more time. And meanwhile, then let me introduce our very distinguished speaker, Professor Wayne Typraek from SUNY, from the State University of New York, from Purchase College. Wayne will be familiar to many of you. He, of course, holds degrees.
Can you hear me right now?
Yes, now I can hear you. Let me just briefly introduce Wayne, and then I'll pass over to you, Ulrich. Yeah. Wayne Typraek has, of course, a very long and distinguished career, which started with degrees at Calvin College and the University of Michigan. He works on revolution, contentious politics, and particularly religious coexistence in early modern Europe. You will be familiar, of course, with his work on religious war and religious peace in early modern Europe, as well as shaping history, ordinary people in European politics, 1500 to 1700. But with the work today, he has taken things to the present. He has, in a way, done precisely what also our two institutions very much focus on, namely to take kind of applied history approach to see how the past helps us to understand the challenges of the present. And his most recent book, about which he will also be talking today as the starting point for our discussion, is Religious Peace Then and Now, published in 2022. What we'll of course be talking about is what is the prevalence and prospect of religious peace today as conflicts again are raging around the world. But now over to you, Ulrich.
Tom, many thanks for your introduction, and also a warm welcome from Bonn, Germany, to Wayne Typraek and all the listeners. We are much looking forward to your presentation. We have never met in person, but I'm most hopeful that we can arrange that also either in Aberdeen or elsewhere. And I would only like to add from our side that there is a new focus on religion, politics and force in Bonn, and we are happy to welcome even more events on these topics in the months and years to come. So without further ado, Wayne, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. But more importantly, thank you for the invitation to do this discussion. You folks and your institutions more broadly represent an entirely new audience for me, I think. And in fact, the presentation I will give you today really assumes that you don't know that much about my work or about me. And I will try to outline where I think I am right now. And I will read a text so as not to get lost in the weeds. And I will show some slides, which I hope are provocative of a good discussion. But to get started, then let me share my screen if I know how to do this properly. And I will get started. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have to get something off my screen. There we go. Since the end of the Cold War, a variety of actors in places as diverse as Bosnia, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Syria, and Myanmar have exploited religious differences to pursue political agendas using violent means. To characterize these conflicts as religious is not to say they are about religion. Rather, the adjective usefully highlights the way political actors identify their enemies in terms of their religious beliefs, practices, or affiliations, and mobilize their allies via networks of religious solidarity and trust. The problem is that framing conflicts as religious makes it very difficult to envision a path towards peace because compromise with evil seems to be out of the question. The current tragedy in Israel and Gaza is at once one of the oldest as well as the most recent explosion in this global resurgence of religious polarization, violence, and war. In all these conflicts, the immediate drama of the battlefield headlines easily distorts any visions of a more peaceful future. But in fact, religious peace has a long and rich history that is directly relevant to our understanding of conflict today. Though many people reflexively see religion as the cause of most wars, I contend that religious peace has been more clearly a constant feature of the human condition, disrupted only episodically by violence, revolution, and war. The premise of religious peace then and now is that what we can learn from Europe's experience with religious peacemaking will help us to recognize religious peace today when we see it and to promote its restoration where it is currently being disrupted by religious violence and war. Hoping to liberate the study of religious peace from the long shadow of religious war, I sharpened the traditional and very general definition of peace by focusing on religious peace in particular. Distinguishing between negative religious peace, the absence of war, and positive religious peace, the presence of durable forms of coexistence. This has helped me to recognize religious peace is much more common than we might otherwise think it is, largely because we take religious pluralism for granted. In addition, recognizing that religious peace is much more than the absence of war clarified what I needed to look for in places and religious cultures outside the scope of my personal experience or professional expertise. The challenge, as I say, is to recognize religious peace when we see it. Still, I realized that to demonstrate the contemporary relevance of Europe's religious peacemaking, I would first have to situate Europe's religious wars within a global chronology and geography of religious war. Here's a graphic summary of what I found. This graph underscores two essential features of the global history of religious war. First, religious war has been a recurrent feature of recorded history only since the 5th century of the Common Era. And which is when the Roman Empire officially adopted Christianity as the official religion. And while there were previous clusters of religious war in the 8th and 12th and 13th centuries, the surge of religious warfare in the 16th and 17th century was by far the largest. Second, the vast majority of religious wars recorded in history have taken place in Europe and the Middle East. But the surge of religious wars in the 19th century hinted at the globalization of the problem of religious war. For the first time in recorded history, the majority of religious wars were located in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Unfortunately, my graph and the Encyclopedia of Wars from which I culled my data does not include our current cycle of religious conflict, violence, and war. As I see it, our current cycle began against the background of sectarianization in Middle Eastern politics with the war in Bosnia in the early 1990s. And it exploded internationally in the first years of the 21st century with the terror attacks on 9/11 and the American-led war on terrorism. The latter has contributed to multiple waves of armed conflict, including sectarian civil wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, which have made the Middle East a focal point of religious war for the first time since the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, in sub-Saharan Africa, a series of sensational attacks and counterattacks between Muslims and Christians have overshadowed equally significant sectarian struggles among Christians and Muslims, from Burkina Faso and Cameroon in the west to the Central African Republic, Ethiopia, and Sudan in the east. Finally, our current cycle includes polarizing religious conflicts and wars characterized by the rise of by the rise of post-colonial nationalisms in South Asia, from Pakistan and India to Sri Lanka and Myanmar. Even though this cycle is ongoing, it seems obvious that the only precedent for what we are experiencing today is early modern Europe's cycle of religious war and religious peace. I can't seem to reverse. Oh, here we go. I wanted to get back to here. I'm still learning how to use Microsoft Teams, and I'm not experienced with teaching online since I'm retired. With this as context, I distilled what we can learn from European history in the first part of my book. The prerequisite of lethal religious conflict, violence, and war in early modern Europe was the politicization of religious differences, in extreme cases, the dehumanization of religious others during the disintegration of Latin Christendom during and after the Protestant Reformation. A variety of political actors who had ready access to violent means, kings, princes, magistrates, militia leaders, or warlords, responded to the problems they associated with religious change and fragmentation by aligning themselves with specific claimants to religious authority and unleashing the coordinated destruction of the most concentrated cluster of religious wars in global history. When these wars ended, the religious controversies and violent struggles for political and religious authority had left behind a pervasive pattern of unprecedented religious diversity within a nascent system of competitive territorial states. Now, this chart, of course, is packed with information that I'll be happy to explore with you later, but it is effectively a summary of the research I did for Religious War and Religious Peace in Early Modern Europe, a 350-page book. And I condensed this then into about 60 pages in my new book, and this is the version you get, the chart, for now. As I described and accounted for these 6 clusters of conflict, I formulated a series of postulates regarding religious peace in general. First, that negative religious peace is always possible, even after the most destructive wars. Of course, making durable religious settlements can be hard work because it requires the grudging consent to difficult political compromises by those who control the means of violent coercion, and also because outside interventions recurrently prolong originally domestic conflicts. Second, that positive religious peace is complex and messy because it is the work of many hands, ordinary people as well as rulers. Positive peace is built from the bottom up as ordinary people make independent religious choices and improvise durable modes of religious coexistence in contentious interaction with their proximate rulers. In all cases, violent and costly attempts by intolerant rulers to impose unity and purity on religiously diverse populations have failed miserably. Third, that religious peace is neither perfect nor free. In fact, it is often costly because difficult political compromises inevitably have unintended consequences that recurrently lead to durable inequalities. But imperfect religious peace can nevertheless be durable if its heirs make good trouble and practice nonviolent activism to mitigate its imperfections. Finally, to account for Europe's transition from war to peace, I have identified 4 dynamic mechanisms that in various combinations and in a variety of places recurrently make religious peace possible. They act in combination, I should emphasize, and never independently. Negotiation involving religiously polarized actors can lead to political compromises that create safe spaces for peaceful religious coexistence. Most of Europe's religious wars ended with negotiated settlements expressed in the form of a truce, a treaty, or an edict. But when they did not, military stalemates or nominal victories could also serve to end violence, as long as they left room for less formal accommodations of religious diversity at the local level. Segregation. Segregation among religiously polarized groups can reduce the likelihood of violent encounters, and within contentious religious movements can demilitarize both popular mobilizations and grand political alliances. Domination. Domination, whether military, political, or religious, of one faith community over one or more others in the same political domain can, in fact, bring order or stability to otherwise chaotic situations. Finally, perhaps most importantly, subversion, both political and religious, can create spaces for religious diversity when negotiated settlements or military, political, or religious domination would seem to preclude it. So what then does religious peace look like? A new generation of historians has uncovered a variety of durable patterns of religious coexistence that emerged in Europe prior to the religious wars. They then survived the upheavals of violence, and they eventually served to frame a durable peace. These patterns, or what I call templates, can teach us to recognize religious peace when we see it today. Allow me to show you some examples of the principal templates that I have identified. First, parity. In many places, in many polities and at various times, competitive religious groups and their political allies agreed locally, regionally, or nationally to share sacred and civic spaces on equal terms, despite religious polarization more broadly. This was both the most common and the most common sense strategy for managing religious differences, although it was in many cases subversive of autocratic policies that forbade religious compromise. Integration. In a few polities, negotiated political settlements formally integrated multiple religious groups into political, judicial, and cultural institutions, thereby reducing the salience of religious differences in public life. The most famous and durable cases were Poland, Lithuania, this is for you, Karen, and France. Privilege. In polities where political authorities allied with religious authorities to privilege a specific denomination, dissenters, who made religious choices different from their rulers, often agreed to keep up the appearance of privilege and avoid trouble by worshiping in spaces that did not look like churches, or quietly commuting to places where they could worship freely. And repression. And in polities where rulers claimed exclusive religious authority and actively enforced conformity, dissenters nevertheless survived, sometimes for decades and even centuries, by worshiping clandestinely and feigning conformity. This template for coexistence was clearly the costliest for managing diversity, not only for the dissenters, but also for the autocratic rulers, because repression proved to be very hard and in the end futile work. Please note the instrumental role that ordinary people, especially dissenters, played in the process of constructing the durable structures of religious diversity. Over several decades of research, I have also developed a conceptual map of these templates for the accommodation of religious diversity. It highlights variation in two dimensions: in the official policies of specific regimes, ranging from exclusive to inclusive of religious diversity, the horizontal dimension, and in the visibility and thus the salience of religious differences in public life, the vertical dimension. The parity and integration templates on the right side reflect official policies that may be considered inclusive, while privilege and repression both represent officially exclusive policies. Meanwhile, privilege and parity are similar in the sense that they increase the visibility and salience of religious differences in public life, while both repression and integration effectively reduce the visibility and salience of religious identities in public life. Finally, in the middle of the diagram, ad hoc tolerance describes the experience of specific religious groups who were granted a limited space for self-regulation of their religious practices and were neither fully included nor fully excluded. Their differences were at least partially visible, yet not fully salient in public life. Against this historical background, the second part of my book demonstrates how the lens of European history can help us to recognize religious peace when we see it, not just in the West, but globally. European history can also show us how to promote peace where it is currently being disrupted and to maintain it where it shows signs of fragility. I'll start with the challenge of recognizing peace when we see it. To illustrate the prevalence of religious peace today, I have described the religious landscapes of 4 diverse communities that I think are emblematic of very different political and cultural histories, both in the cultural West and beyond. I'll start in Ossining, New York, my hometown, where I found what I call a neo-European peace. What I discovered on long walks during the extended COVID shutdown is that a very visible 19th century white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ascendancy has been steadily displaced by more subtle integration of Catholic, Jewish, Hispanic, evangelical, and Pentecostal, and Islamic newcomers. The broader historical context for this is that while European colonial settlements transplanted Christian diversity to North America, they did not bring with them Europe's religious wars. Indeed, despite serious strains both historically and today, the First Amendment to the US Constitution has preserved an integration template for religious peace in an increasingly diverse religious landscape. Second, in Mainz, Germany, I found what I call a new Old World peace. As the most important archbishopric in Germany, Mainz was a Catholic bulwark during the wars of religion, but it became visibly more diverse through troubled times since the 17th century. Multiple revolutions, 2 lengthy foreign occupations, and 2 world wars. Today, mainline Catholics and Protestants still visually dominate the old city, but independent and Pentecostal Christians, plus a broad spectrum of Islamic diversity, characterize the suburbs. Moving east and outside of what we would call the cultural West today, in Istanbul, Turkey, I found a post-imperial peace. A long history of ad hoc tolerance of the people of the book under the Ottoman Empire was replaced by a French-style inclusion model under the modern republic. But this is being steadily eroded today by a facade of Islamic unity and purity. Nevertheless, a visible remnant of Christian and Jewish diversity coexists peacefully with a growing and less visible Islamic diversity on the ground, especially outside the old city. Finally, the farthest away from home for me, in Hong Kong, I found what I call a post-colonial peace. To be sure, British colonial rule brought Christian, Jewish, Islamic, and Hindu diversity to what was originally a small village. But the religious landscape of this modern economic powerhouse is still visibly Chinese. What is distinctive of both Hong Kong and the larger mainland China is that among the traditional teachings, there are no rigid ritual or theological boundaries, and there is no dominant majority. In fact, Hong Kong is illustrative of the 6 Asian political territories that are among, according to the Pew Research Center's index, among the 10 most religiously diverse territories in the world. Now, the religious facts on the ground that we find in these very different examples are rooted in distinctive histories that are nevertheless have 2 characteristics in common with early modern Europe. These characteristics are that they are in flux due to ongoing religious pluralization, not only in the Abrahamic religions of the West, but in the distinctive religions of South and Southeast Asia. They are also subject to intermittent waves of mass migration, both voluntary and coerced, most often tied to the autocratic intolerance both voluntary and coerced mass migration, most often tied to the rise of autocratic intolerance and religious nationalism. Consequently, the specific emblems of religious coexistence we find today are often quite new, even though the templates that structure their coexistence have deep historical roots. Now, seeing the varieties of diversity and recognizing peace when we see it are, at bottom, cognitive and perceptual challenges. They are a necessary precondition to envisioning and promoting a more peaceful world, but they do not in themselves change the world. To change the world, to respond to what I see as the moral imperative of preserving and promoting religious peace, we must become activists. In the final chapters of my book, then, I demonstrate how thinking with European history can help us to become active and effective peacemakers. So, once again, how big is the challenge we face? Today, as I suggested earlier, we are confronted globally with a variety of situations in which the politicization of religious differences, polarization along those boundaries, and escalation of religious contention have led to or threatened to lead to the coordinated destruction of religious wars. In almost all cases, the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and many of the member states of the EU have either been actively collaborating with one side or another, or passively complicit in humanitarian and political disasters. Though ordinary citizens cannot directly control the actions of repressive or exclusionary governments abroad, we can hold our own political leaders to account through democratic elections, public protests, and by means of participation in or collaboration with organizations that have more direct access to our rulers, or in some cases, with the victims or the victimizers abroad. In short, we can and should engage in proactive peacemaking. And I should say, by proactive peacemaking, I'm trying to emphasize the distinction with negative or reactive peacemaking, which is ending wars. Proactive peacemaking is about preventing escalations and perhaps even wars. When ordinary citizens claim ownership and by extension accept responsibility for these conflicts, even when they are far from home, we can move from observation and historical recognition to envisioning and actively promoting religious peace. It just takes doing our homework and practicing responsible engagement. Doing our homework requires asking the right questions, looking for religious cultural diversity when we least expect to find it, and recognizing the powerful agency of those who may seem powerless. So what are the questions? Well, they're simple. What does the religious, political, and cultural landscape of any particular place or setting look like? How did the current patterns of diversity come into being? And how and to what extent do political actors use sectarian identities to mark their differences? This then leads to the question of, so when and how should we engage as peacemakers? When political actors, as a rule of thumb, we should engage both individually and as communities when political actors invoke religious, ethnic issues and identities to mark their political enemies as well as their friends, and when rulers and their religious allies attempt to coerce conformity to a particular set of religious or cultural beliefs and practices. The final chapter then proposes nonviolent activism, what the great civil rights leader and legislator John Lewis called making trouble, making good trouble, as the guiding principle of religious peacemaking. My personal commitment to nonviolent political activism grew out of my opposition to the Vietnam War and my decision to become a conscientious objector to the war. But I was inspired by the discipline and political success of the civil rights movement of the 1960s in hundreds of racial injustice in the United States. Clearly, that struggle is still not over, but it does not diminish the impressive success of the civil rights movement. More recently, however, as a scholar, I have come to recognize nonviolent activism as the cutting edge of the religious pluralization process in early modern Europe and beyond. In hundreds of communities, competitive religious groups learn to share sacred and civic spaces in many places, and they continue to do so today. Meanwhile, religious dissenters learn to avoid trouble by worshiping discreetly or clandestinely, as many religious newcomers also do today. And from the beginning, nonviolent popular reform movements, From the beginning, non-popular reform movements propelled the religious reform process, where religious change was institutionalized. But where religious change was frustrated, popular support was equally critical in defending the faith. Since then, nonviolent religious activism has been I have this in in the wrong order. Since then, nonviolent religious activism has been at the cutting edge of efforts to mitigate the injustices of durable religious inequalities. There is also a growing body of research that shows that in the last century or so, nonviolent civil resistance has been nearly twice as likely to achieve full or partial success than violent campaigns for large-scale change. Indeed, it is clear that the political practices of nonviolent activism are an essential element of any peacemaker's toolkit. So here then are what I see as the fundamentals of religious proactive peacemaking. Peacemaking is simple. The foundations of durable peace are laid by ordinary people doing awful, simple things that come naturally to them. Peacemaking is effective. The accumulation of apparently simple acts can and does mitigate and even prevent the worst effects of official intolerance and systematic violence. Peacemaking is subversive. Most often, it requires us to see war as the problem, not the solution to our problems. It always requires us to question authorities who demand conformity or insist on their version of ethnic, national, ideological, or religious unity and purity. Peacemaking can be costly. Its most common immediate cost is inequality, which can become institutionalized, durable, and unjust. The unintended consequence for the peacemaker, then, is that it requires an ongoing commitment to justice once the threat of organized violence has passed. For in the end, without peace, there can be no justice. Without justice, no peace can last. So, thank you for your attention, and I will try to exit screen sharing. There we go.
Thank you so very much. Absolutely fascinating. And in a way, I was reminded of the kind of famous saying in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. In a way, we of course have the same problem in scholarship, is that I suppose we all have a tendency to study conflict. We have a tendency to study when things blow up, and look far less at when things go at cases of success. As a result of that, I suppose we might also have the wrong historical image of religious coexistence or non-coexistence, because of when it bleeds, it leads. We tend to look at cases of religious wars rather than religious coexistence. In that sense, I was intrigued both now as well as reading your work before on your focus on that the norm is coexistence rather than the breakdown of coexistence. I also like the focus in the kind of subversive nature, the kind of almost subaltern approach that you're taking here, the activist approach. But in a way, I'd still like to focus to push you a little bit, even just for the sake of the argument, for the other side of the coin, about the kind of also because at least I guess both our centers deal very much with governance. So what are the implications here for governance, not for the people from below, but for those who create the structures, or who can change the structures, or who can also implement policy, both in terms of, I suppose, resilience. So what are the success factors of resilience? And in terms of policy, what do you need to do in terms of policy making to create a system that is resilient and where religious coexistence sustains peace rather than undermines it? I mean, later I'll also push you a little bit on ending wars and the repair after conflict, but maybe let's start with that with this question.
Okay, well, I think it's more than one question there, but
sorry.
Let me see if I can recall them, because I forgot to take notes while you were talking. First, I want to say that it's important to me to see religious peace and religious war as having simultaneous histories. For example, my point in what I've really discovered, to my surprise, in European history, was that religious peace preceded the wars. The wars disrupted it, but not entirely. Where war was not active, where people were not being killed, where communities were not being destroyed, there was peace. People still lived successfully together. And so if we see in the long term, the history of war is episodic, but the history of religious coexistence is more continuous. And even wars do not entirely disrupt that. So when the violence of war ends, those memories, if nothing else, but more often the actual practices, the ongoing practices of religious peace are right there. Now, from the point of view of policy making, which is, I think, where you wanted me to focus here, what that suggests is that even in times of war, we have to be continually thinking about how to support the foundation of peace. And the foundation of peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of durable, functioning structures of religious diversity. And so, in addition to thinking about whether we should support someone's war effort or not, or whether we should intervene to prevent other kinds of devastations, such as are going on right now in Gaza, we need to be we need to recognize one of the great tragedies of this current episode in Israel and Gaza is that just prior to the explosion of that attack on Israel, the majority of people in Gaza supported a negotiated settlement for coexistence. They did not support Hamas. And on the other side of the border, the tragedy is that many of the people who were killed were people who moved to that proximate place to the border to demonstrate that coexistence was the foundation of peace in Israel and in Gaza. Now, how do we support those things? There are many, many ways we can do that. But we first of all have to recognize that even when war is going on, maybe not in Gaza anymore because it is so totally destroyed, but in many war-torn places, the practices of religious coexistence, in other words, the foundations of positive religious peace, are still in place. And we need to identify those actors who are critical to that and support their work. And I think we have to think, in other words, beyond the requirements of the logic of military struggle in the middle of war, and think very profoundly about something more than diplomacy even, but the nurturing and sustenance of the patterns of religious coexistence that make peace possible.
Thank you. Ulrich.
So thank you so much for this wonderful overview. I do have a principal question to which I don't know the answer, and I guess that you can illuminate us. How do you see the rupture, the change of the state system in 1989 as a defining moment of what you have discussed against the background of the development of 4 or 5 centuries? The question is the following. Can we really, in our world of globalization, learn that much from European history? Or to put it in another way, isn't it what we see in our times partly identical, but also partly different from what you have studied when you look at the course of history from the 16th to the 20th century? And that has to do perhaps with with Europe, with a decline of Europe as a center of gravity, but also a shift towards other religious contents, a shift back from what you have described to political Islam and other movements.
Yes. Well, I think there are two things about your question that I'd like to address. One is at the very beginning, you asked whether it was whether there were differences as well as similarities, and that's the point of comparison. Of course, what you try to do is find a foundation of similarity, and then the really hard part is explaining the differences, the different trajectories from similar starting points. And so that really is what I try to do in my own work and try to encourage in the work of others. Now, about the changes and differences between the 16th and 17th centuries and the present day, two things I emphasize, and I went over them very quickly. One of them is obviously religious pluralization, sudden, kind of surprising, or very surprising, I should say. And that graph, that genealogy of religious differences in Western Christianity just merely suggested how dramatic that breakup of Western Latin Christendom was. That's one thing. The other point of similarity is that we are still basically dealing with a world of competitive territorial states and militarized territorial states. That's what emerged to power the wars in early modern Europe, a newly created system of, or a system of competitive national states in creation. And it's still powering most of the wars today because the wars start domestically. They start as movements that some people object to, changes that disturb people's claims to power and authority and so forth. And then they get internationalized when outside interventions choose to favor one side or another and so on. But what I think is what's really important for us, or at least it was important for me, was to realize the importance in our current situation of the decline of the authority of the Ottoman Sultanate in the 19th century, and then the destruction of the Ottoman Caliphate by the Revolutionary Republic in Turkey in 1924. That is a little bit like the destruction of Latin Christendom under the control of Rome and the Roman Catholic Church. And that has opened up a lot of struggles for political authority. And one of the most obvious contenders for that replacement of that caliphate today is, of course, ISIS-K, or ISIS in general. And there, what's been happening today and what happened historically is that as there were new claimants to religious authority, they offered opportunities and challenges to existing rulers. And when those claimants make good alliances, political and religious authorities make solid alliances, you've got the foundations for the kind of conflict that we're having today. And in my diagram of our current situation, I highlighted the foundations of a lot of the sectarianization in Middle Eastern politics is the events that occurred in the late 70s in Saudi Arabia with the embrace of Wahhabism, a very Salafist and very radical version of Islam, and the success of the Iranian Revolution, which brought to power a Shiite adversary, and for the first time in a long time, a Shiite adversary in the Middle East. And though that competition, along with the war on terrorism, has created the stuff for a lot of interrelated conflicts today. I think there are really reasonable parallels to be seen there. The question is, what are we going to analyze in particular? I can't do it all, but I've tried to suggest that the way out of the kinds of problems we have today requires us to look at specific cases, to answer those basic questions, and then see how that compares with other trajectories and what the options are, because there are always multiple paths from religious war to religious peace. And that is something that's required from us. There's not a singular path. There's no one size that fits all. And there are new kinds of religious nationalisms that confound us entirely. Who would have thought 20 years ago that Buddhism would be the cutting edge of religious war and genocidal violence in Myanmar or in Sri Lanka? But we have to pay attention to those things. And we need to become more familiar. I have a slide that I could show, but it's in the back of my book too. The complexity of sectarian differences within Islam is probably even more confounding in many ways than the sectarianism in Christianity. The differences among different versions of it. And when those different versions become allied with people who control violent coercion, you've got the makings of war. And so what we have to look for is preventing or segregating those religious movements from those who have control coercion. And we have to look at ways to sustain the patterns of religious coexistence that precede war. You don't have religious war without religious diversity. And like diversity, it starts at the bottom. Like positive peace, religious war starts at the bottom. It starts with conflicts here and there that then escalate, both today and historically.
Thank you.
Sorry, I hope I haven't lost the thread of your question.
No, thank you so much. It's very helpful.
Robert Frost. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Robert?
Yes.
Oh, there he is. Hi, Robert.
Hi, there I am. Hi, Wayne. Great to see you.
Great to see you.
Fascinating talk. I have two questions. The first is, you talked about ordinary people and the way in which they reach religious accommodations. I think that's a very important point. One of the features of the Reformation period in Poland, Lithuania, which you mentioned, is the diversity of religious marriages, interfaith marriages.
Oh, yes.
You have a large number of marriages in which frequently the woman becomes a Protestant. There's a famous family in Lithuania, the Kiška, where the woman is an anti-Trinitarian, married to a Catholic. And the way in which families actually negotiate these differences is understudied and actually quite fascinating. But then, of course, the religious authorities are often the problem in these matters, which last to this day, the Catholic Church refusing to marry you in church if you don't agree to bring up the children as Catholics. And there are all sorts of barriers in that way.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, the role of ordinary people who have to get on with their lives, who don't necessarily listen all the time to what the clerics are telling them. The second point is to do with law and institutions. Poland and Lithuania, one of the remarkable features of the Union of Lublin and what follows is how little religion mattered in the situation after the death of the last king of the Jagiellon dynasty, when there's an election and they decide that the election is going to happen by all citizens, and 40,000 turn up to elect Henry of Valois. And what's remarkable is how little religion plays a role in this. It's a purely secular matter because they have a vision of republican citizenship, which overrides the religious divisions. And they passed famously the Warsaw Confederation, which says we are not going to pursue each other in the courts or kill each other over religious matters. But that's literally passed only for the interregnum. And thereafter, the fact that Catholic bishops sit in the secular institution of the Sejm, the parliament, means that every attempt by Protestants to get legal teeth put into this toleration fails. They want actual legal sanctions that say, if a Protestant church is demolished, we can take them to court, or we can uphold our right to free worship because there are secular laws. And every time those are blocked by the Catholic bishops, who won't hear anything about it, although there is one bishop who actually signs the Warsaw Confederation eventually. So how does the law adjust to uphold that toleration of religious difference, and to prevent the idea, which certainly becomes true in the 17th century in Poland and Lithuania, that yes, people of different religions, mainly Orthodoxy, the Uniate Church, but also various degrees of Protestantism, are not second-class citizens.
Yeah.
i.e. they're sort of tolerated, but they don't have full rights, which is a modern problem.
It is. It's a very modern problem. Let me start with the ordinary people, since that's where you started. I became convinced of the role of ordinary people only when I decided, in the context of a larger project I had with a group of about 35 historians who were looking for the evidence for religious accommodation in during and after the Reformation in Europe generally. And everybody was looking at places where there was room, or there was safe space for religious coexistence. And it was an important thing to do. I remember in the middle of a conference I was running, Fikret Adner from Bochum stopped our conversation and he said, "Why don't we just make it official right now? Why don't we agree that religious accommodation is the rule and not the exception?" And that was a really important point. But what I realized is that nobody was talking about the difficult cases where interreligious marriage is forbidden, where conformity is enforced in a variety of means. And so I started looking at the difficult cases. I looked at, instead of looking at the northern Netherlands, where there was structural space for diversity, in fact, it was required that no one be persecuted for matters of conscience in the Dutch Republic. In the South, it was a different story. There was officially a compulsory adherence to Catholicism. They enforced it with a new version of the religious tribunals for about 20 years. It was hard work. They stopped. And there were pockets of religious diversity in various parts of the southern Netherlands that survived and are still there today, and as part of the diversity of the southern Netherlands, of Belgium, of modern Belgium. And then I went to Ireland, which is really a tough case. How is it that Catholicism survives under such repressive rule? Where the incentives to become Protestant are enormous and the disincentives for being Catholic are fairly large. And then I went to France finally and looked at the survival of diversity under France's rejection of the Edict of Nantes, Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes from 1678 to 1787. Or was it 84?
85.
85, yeah. Well, I tell my students, you don't have to remember the dates precisely. You just should keep your books so you can look up the date when you really need to know it. And that actually brings me then to, let me say some conclusions about studying those really difficult cases. That there are a number of really interesting mechanisms that allow for survival under systematic repression. And the first one, of course, is secrecy. The second one is just as logical. It's dissimulation, pretending to conform rather than conforming. The third is the term that was used in the 16th and 17th century, connivance. People survive by connivance because their neighbors refuse to testify against them, or their customers won't accept the restriction that you have to buy from members of our faith or something like that. And connivance was a very important part of the survival of Catholics in the Netherlands, for example. Officially, they weren't supposed to worship, but they worship everywhere in large numbers. And they had equally large numbers with the dominant Calvinists throughout the early modern period. And so connivance is very important. And then finally, it's private education. Private education is very important to the survival of diversity, because under pressure, people have to teach your children and their followers how to survive. And they often alter that. They alter what the strict provisions of the religion are in order to survive. So those are the ways that ordinary people are terribly important in the preservation of religious diversity, not only historically, but today. And it happens all around the world. And connivance and the kindness of strangers and all of that are principles that really are important for the preservation of religious peace today. Now, what about law and institutions? Well, if you think about the process you described for Poland, Lithuania, and how Catholic bishops sitting within institutions of power are able to push the balance away from real integration and reduce people to their counterparts in other faiths, and they're multiple, push them into a kind of second-class citizenship. Same thing happened in France. From 1563 onward, there was a principle of integration of Catholics and Protestants in the same political domain. And though the wars disrupted that principle, recurrently, every treaty and every peace settlement after each of the French civil wars, which numbered 9, was the restoration of that principle of integration. As time went on, those agreements, those laws made stronger the preservation of diversity by saying, specifying that Protestants or dissenters had access to civic institutions, to education, to permitted inter-religious marriage and things like that. But after the culmination of that process was, of course, the famous Edict of Nantes, which I illustrated, but it has 7 predecessors that did the same things. In the aftermath of the Edict of Nantes, there was a very successful integration, due in part to the effort of the state, of special commissioners to make sure that integration worked. But in the aftermath of the end of the 30 Years' War, the French state began seriously to align itself with the biggest of these, obviously, the Catholic Church, and began to restrict the meaning of integration of Protestants. And before the revocation occurred, in fact, many of those things had been, many of the things that preserved diversity and protected it were undermined before the final act of the revocation. That revocation never actually came in Poland, but it was a similar process in France. And that is the kind of thing that is possibly going on in places like Turkey today, where the government is trying increasingly to enforce a kind of conformity, project a kind of conformity to its version of Sunni Islam. And in fact, a fairly sizable population, at least in places like Istanbul, where we can actually, observe it fairly effectively, are not conforming, and they're using the same strategies as it had been used before. I'll never forget the first time I taught a collaborative course with a colleague from Koç University in Istanbul. She invited me to come and give one of our collaborative classes, effectively teaching my students in New York from her classroom in Istanbul. I was excited. And I had a student in my class, a young woman who identified herself as a practicing Muslim prior to the class. But she asked me, before the class started, she asked me not to identify her or to emphasize her distinctive religious practices, because she was part of a Sufi sect that still practices the whirling, the devotions. And she was almost sort of embarrassed about that. But I said, no, I love having you here, but I promise I will not reveal any of that to the folks, the other students in Istanbul, whom I think you're a little bit nuts. Okay. When I went to teach that class in Istanbul towards the end of the term, I said, could you tell me where I could look for the Jerahi, what is it? I can't remember the term. The term of the temple that was the origination or the headquarters of the sect that she practices across the Hudson River in Rockland County. Can I go look at that place? Can you tell me where it is? And she said, I wouldn't want you to do that because you could get them in trouble. If I went there to look as a tourist or even as an academic, it could get those folks in trouble, and they would be repressed by the current regime in Turkey. So these things are processes. When I talk about processes like pluralization or the becoming of war and coming of peace and things like that, I usually talk in terms of mechanisms. And the logic of mechanisms, at least, is that they operate in almost identical ways wherever they operate. Polarization is polarization. Escalation is escalation, whether it's 18th century or 17th century or 21st century, it's escalation. And those kinds of things then are modular. The practices of religious coexistence are modular, and they can be translated into very different settings, and the processes continue to work in very similar ways. The processes, however, often have different outcomes. That's the hard part, right? The mechanisms help us to understand not only the similarities of a particular moment in time when we can observe, oh, that's like that, but you can also observe how those things come into being or how they're sustained over time, thinking of mechanisms. But you always have to realize that larger processes like pluralization and mass migration and all of those kinds of major problems have alternative outcomes. Processes are different from mechanisms. Processes, in fact, are processes are recurrences that we can recognize, but we have to then try to explain why some end up over here and some end up over there.
Thank you.
And that's the hard part of comparative analysis.
One of the hard parts is, of course, also how you get from how you to prove, and I say this as a German Huguenot, how you actually prevent polarization to totally escalate before the process of repolarization starts. But that's more a comment because it's really up to Karin Friedrich to ask a question.
Thanks very much. Thanks a lot, Wayne. Thanks, Tom, for
hi, Karin.
Yeah, hi, Wayne. Great to see you. Interesting, really interesting talk. And I was just wondering, you talked about the parallels, obviously, of the past and the present, just with Robert, and also, how this ordinary people and all of that. But I think what you also emphasized in your talk, I thought, was the real importance of outside interference. and that there are certain forces, that actually create or make religious warfare, war and unrest worse. But I'm just wondering to what extent a lot of the outside interference is often under the guise of really not religious war, but territorial war, or war for territory. And I think one of the problems of the Gaza conflict is exactly that it's perhaps not necessarily just mainly a religious conflict, but actually a territorial conflict. And very often that was also in the past, where you had, the cynical use of orthodoxy, by Russia to essentially partition and influence, destroy Poland, Lithuania. So I mean, there are various parallels there. But what I'm wondering is whether the parallels today are harder to find to history since we have social media, and so the whole role. And this goes back a little bit to the question that Ulrich Schlie asked. To what extent can we still compare processes as well as mechanisms at an age when we have fake news and social media and echo chambers that can really influence, both religious and other war? I mean, it doesn't really matter then anymore, whether it is a territorial conflict or a religious conflict, and that mixes it in a particularly heinous way. So just that.
Okay, let me start with the question about territorial as opposed to religious war. By calling something a religious conflict or a religious war, I'm not saying that it's about religion or that it's the primary, these are the primary issues. What happens is that religion in so many times and places, but especially in the 16th and 17th centuries and today, serves as a kind of mask for other kinds of issues. Territorial conquest is not allowable or kosher under international law, right? And so you use powerful religious imagery as Putin has done very imaginatively and very, well, not imaginative. He's tried to do in revving up the Russian population to support his conquest of Ukraine, but it's all wrapped up in religion. Now, that doesn't mean it's about religion. It means that is the device that he's using. And as we probably all could recognize, when you do that and you frame issues as good and evil, it's then hard to find the basis for compromise, because you can't compromise with evil. So that's one side of it. So please don't think that when I say these are religious conflicts, and I use it as an adjective and not as a noun. It's not about religion. It's religious in the sense that that's the identifying term that covers a lot of other things. The other part of your question was, oh gosh, I've forgotten it. What you ended up with something different.
Essentially, having new means of warfare, i.e. echo chambers.
Oh yes, yes. I see, especially there's a real danger, of course, in modern social media, because it can be such a megaphone of the kinds of distortions that encourage polarization and thus refusal to compromise. There is that effect, but it doesn't mean that we can't see what's going on because of all the fog of war. War has always produced a lot of fog that makes it hard to see what's really going on. I don't think we should despair of being able to track processes and mechanisms at work, and thus understand and analyze our current situations. And it's not a situation, but situations of very different sorts, and try to find peaceful outcomes where there currently is violence and destruction. And so, I think the fact that I could write this book that we're talking about today is a miracle of modern social media and modern technology, because I wrote it under COVID lockdown, and I could access all of the historical materials, or enough historical materials online to do that. And I could walk around my community like I had never done before. I was forced to doing it, but I discovered things about my own community. In fact, I discovered a Islamic prayer room in Ossining that I never knew existed, and I would mention it to my friends and nobody knew about it. And today, finally, there's a sign up that points towards its very hidden existence behind a fuel company's offices. And it says Ossining Masjid, and that's it. It's now becoming visible. And I wouldn't have seen that if I hadn't attended to the same things I attended to historically, by looking for diversity where it isn't, and looking at the agency of people who may seem powerless, but are by no means powerless.
Other questions? I could maybe ask a question about the use of hard power. I mean, of which you're of course not a big fan, but I wonder what exactly is for you? Is there a space for hard power? I mean, I understand the argument about activism from below and so on, but what are the conditions under which this can thrive? I guess in different contexts, in the context of making existing peace sustainable, but also in terms of returning or ending wars and returning conflict to peace. Are you suggesting that the use of hard power, the cost of hard power always outweighs the benefits? Or are you saying that there has to be a balance between how hard power is being used in the use of kind of activism from below?
Yeah, I identify myself as a conscientious objector to war because historically that's true. As a young man, I was forced to choose something that I was forced to make choices about a place that I could never not have found on a map a few years earlier. And I found that my only possible choice was to be a conscientious objector to war. If I didn't want to leave my country, if I didn't want to just say, I give up. So I said to the draft system, which was about to pull me into that war, I said, I will come back from my fellowship in Amsterdam, where I'm studying, to stand to resist your induction if you try to induct me into this war, and accept prison. And then they finally gave me my conscientious objector status. Do I think all hard power is wrong? No, but that's what I was forced to say at that point in my life. And I was fairly sincere about it. And I still am fairly sincere about it. Most often, I think we have to look at hard power, coercive hard power, as limited. It's not the solution to the problems that we face in most cases. But if you look at my sense of what ends war, what makes peace possible, negotiation's there, but it doesn't always happen. Segregation doesn't always work, and certainly as an isolated thing, it rarely works if it's the only thing you're working on is segregation. And I very reluctantly say domination or hard power can be very helpful, because it can bring order and stability to very chaotic situations. So it can be used in those situations, but it can never be the only thing. It has to be in combination with segregation, where that might work to prevent violent encounters, where negotiation has not yet worked. And let's see, what was the other thing I had? Well, in any case, it never works simply in isolation. And subversion is always essential as the counterpoint to domination or hard power. And that's the power from below. Those two are never work independently. But without hard power, you wouldn't have subversion. And without subversion,
that's right.
You wouldn't have stability and order.
But that, of course, makes it so interesting. This is not just in terms of returning or ending wars or ending conflicts, but also of preventing conflicts. Is precisely this is, I think it's really fascinating what you've just said. Is that how do we create a system, which brings us also back to governance or through security? How do we make the absence of war sustainable? And that has, of course, a lot to do with activism from below, with commitment to a coexistence. But the question then still is, what degree of, for instance, deterrence do you need to deter certain actors from disrupting the peace?
Yeah, and that's a really important question, both domestically and internationally. What do we do in a society to prevent bad actors? Hey, it's a current issue in the United States.
Sure.
I'm scared to death about what's going to happen in November or before then. Gosh, I've got a rumbling in my house that sounds like an earthquake, but I haven't experienced an earthquake here for 40 years, so it's gone. The little rumble. Or it distracted me for a moment.
Maybe very topical.
Yeah, very topical. Where was I? Could you help me? I really lost my train of thought there for a second.
You're looking at the kind of balance between hard power and soft power, and both domestically as well as internationally.
Yes,
and you were talking about the danger of what might happen in November.
Yes. But so it's not just a matter of global security in that international sense, but it's also it's an important part of domestic security. That balance between coercive power of say judicial institutions, but also security forces, right? Those things are both involved, and it's important to realize, I think, that the balance has to result in something that is trustworthy, because you can't have compromise, I think, without trust. Trust is essential to compromise. Compromise is essential to peace. And peace, I think, is essential to security. So it gets down to whether dominance or hard power is trustworthy. That is to say, people will put their own interests into danger, believing that the other party will act responsibly. That's the foundation of trust. It's a relational thing. Okay. And so hard power can never be too hard, but it's also always necessary. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, particularly I was just looking for a definition of security. Is if we understand the security is the dynamic operationalization and protection of the state of peace over time.
Yes. Then, if that's the goal of security, then I think we're on the right path. Yeah. If the goal of security in preparation for for hard power internationally is to win the next war, I'm not sure. I think we're on the wrong track, because then we'll be the hammer in search of a nail. We'll look for something where we can use our hard power, and enough governments do that in negative ways. But it really is critical for stability in its proper place, in its proper proportion. And so we need to plan for the preservation of peace as opposed to the winning of wars, I think. Does that make sense? Okay. That's where I am.
It certainly makes sense, and it certainly would these kind of interplay would precisely, I suppose, point to how this dynamic operationalization and protection of a state of peace could look like. So that would certainly be a great conclusion for this talk, for the event today. Obviously, there's still lots of food for thought, so we look forward to having you back in the future to see how precisely we can then make peace sustainable. And I think particularly also something that you've just said at the very end, but is absolutely central here, which is the role of trust in all of this, and how trust can be made sustainable and being restored. But that will have to be a discussion for another day. So for now, I would like to thank you for this really wonderful discussion and presentation. I would also like everyone else to attend this event. Our next event, which still needs to be scheduled, will be with Dr. Tim Wilson from the University of St. Andrews, who until recently was director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism there, and he will take a long view on violent lone actors between the 16th century and the present. But for now, thank you so much. You're all welcome to.
Thank you for inviting me again. Good to see you.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you.
Thank you.